Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot and a member of the PMDG 777 beta team. Welcome to this tutorial on the pre-flight procedure or the flight deck setup for the PMDG Boeing 777. If you're interested in a written version including panel scan flow diagrams and background information, check out my ebook in the video description below. Thank you very much, and now let's go on with the tutorial. So the panel scan is made in a pretty simple way. Our panel is divided into several areas and we're basically going from top to bottom, left to right. So we start up here, then we go down on the second page, on the third, on the fourth, we go across the MCP and then down to the control stand like this, and finally down to the pedestal, which we check like this. So let's go right into it and have a look at all the single buttons and knobs we have. We start at the very top with a broadband system switch if it is installed, as this is optional, and make sure that it is guarded. Going down, the ADRU switch is on and the thrust asymmetry compensation computer is in order, primary flight computer is guarded, and the off flight is extinguished. Now, going further down, we check on the electrical panel that the battery is on, the IFE passenger seats and cabin utility switches are on, APU generator on, APU switch as needed, and the off light is extinguished. The bus tie switches are on auto and the external powers again as needed. You've got two possible indications on here, either on if the external power is in use, or avail if the external power is connected to the airplane but not currently in use. Then going further down, when we check our generators, which are all on, both primary and secondary, and the drive disconnect switches are guarded and in the up position. The camera lights are set as needed, and those are lights which illuminate the areas around the main wheels and the nose wheels, so the areas down here and the areas down here. The wipers are off, and that leads us to the second page. So flight recorder or voice recorder switch goes into on, the emergency exit lines have to be armed, service interphone off. This interphone enables the ground crew to talk with the cabin crew as well, and it enables engineers to plug into any of the many plugs that you have in the around the airplane, and not only the one plug that you have located at the nose gear, which connects into the flight interphone system. Further down, the window heat switches go on, the ram air turbine switch is guarded, and the hydraulic panel is set as per our safety inspection, so the engine pumps are on and the rest are turned off. Passenger signs as needed, and what we do over here is we put the no smoking sign into the auto position, and as soon as refueling is finished, the seatbelt sign goes into on. Only use the auto position in flight. On the ground, we always use the on position for the seatbelt signs. This leads us down to the left half of the lighting panel, and over here you basically set the flight deck lights as needed, but there is one switch that you need to carefully ensure is set correctly, and that is the master brightness. You've got the control switch up here, which needs to be pushed in, and then the master brightness itself controls the brightness of all the lights in the cockpit, which are set to the 12 o'clock position on their individual selectors when that little green dot is located right above there. So for example, if I now change the master brightness, you can see that I'm changing the brightness of the overhead panel, the displays, and all the individual backlights here as well. So the master brightness basically controls all the individual lights except for the dome and the floodlights when those are set to the 12 o'clock position. The landing lights are in the off position. Moving on to the third column, we've got our cargo fire panel up there. Make sure that the arm switches are not in the armed position and the discharge switch is guarded. We do not need to perform a fire or overheat test, that is a maintenance function only, and the APU fire knob is pushed in. On the engine panel, we ensure that the electronic engine control mode is norm and that the guards are down, and on the start panel we ensure that norm is selected on both sides. The auto start switch should be on. Moving down to the fuel jettison panel, the nozzles are not activated and guarded, and the arm switch is disarmed. And finally, the fuel to remain selector needs to be pushed in. So when the selector is pushed in, the remaining fuel data comes from the flight management computer. If you pull it out, you would set the fuel to remain manually. How can you tell if the switch is pushed or pulled? Well, quite easy. If it's pulled, you'll see that little shadow down there. If it's pushed, you don't see the shadow at the base of the knob. That's an easy way to find out in the simulator. In the real world, you could of course just press on it a little bit to make sure that it's not pulled, but well. Moving down to the fuel panel, all the fuel pumps are turned off and the thrust feeds are off. You might notice that the left forward pump pressure light is not illuminated. That's the case whenever the APU switch is in the on position, then the left forward pump automatically comes on. And therefore the pressure light is not illuminated. Going down to the anti-ice selectors, they're all in the auto position. And basically we just leave them over there. You wouldn't use the off or on position at this moment, but we will talk a little bit about those a bit later on in the before taxi procedure. Looking at the outside lights of the aircraft, basically during daylight we only need the nav lights, and during night we would use nav and logo lights. All the other lights remain off for now. The indicator lights button can either be set to bright, which is used during the daylight, or to dim, which is used during the night. You wouldn't use the dim position during daylight because some lights might be too dim to actually be able to see them properly, so keep it in the bright position during daylight. We don't need to execute a light test, that is a maintenance function. Going on to the last column then, if our aircraft is equipped with a forward cargo temperature controller, then you would have to set that up here as needed for the cargo that is loaded. And going down to the air conditioning panel, the equipment cooling is on auto, gas per fan on, recirculation fans on. The flight deck temperature is basically set as the pilots need it to be, so the auto position normally is rather hot, so something like the 10 o'clock position is something that you would see in use rather often. The cabin temperature on the other hand side is normally just kept in the 12 o'clock position. And the reason this is done is because the cabin crew have individual controls on the cabin attendant control panel that can change the individual temperatures based off a certain range around the temperature that's set in the flight deck. So 12 o'clock normally gives 24 degrees centigrade, and that gives the cabin attendants a very good range over which they can control the individual cabin zone temperatures. Going further down then, we check that the pack switches are on auto, the trim air is on, the isolation valves are all in auto, and the engine bleeds are on, and the APU bleed is on auto. On the pressurization panel, we check that the outflow valves are in auto, and the landing altitude selector is pushed in. So that's the same that we had on the fuel to remain selector earlier. Make sure that the shadow down here is not visible. That indicates that the selector is pushed in. Moving further down, the wiper selector is in the off position. Then we can go on to the glare shield panel. Starting on the left side, the map light is set as needed, and then we get to the EFIS control panel. Now, the EFIS control panel has changed on the 777 compared to earlier PMDG Boeing aircraft, in that we now can control it the realistic way. What do I mean with that? I'll show you. So, if we take the minimums knob, for example, and move it slightly to the right, you can see that the minimum now continuously increases. If you want to increase it in bigger steps, you can move it further to the right by dragging the mouse a little bit further, and now you can see that it runs in quicker steps. And like that you can easily control the minimums as well as the altimeter setting. So that's a really easy way for you to set the airplane up. Now, we don't need this shown for our departure, so we're just going to reset it. The barrel selector is going to be as needed. Inches are normally used in the western side of the Atlantic, while hectopascals are pretty much used everywhere else. And we're going to set this to the current QNH, so I'm just going to press the B button over here to set this. But I will show you how to request your weather in a few moments anyway. Next up we get to the setup of our navigation display, and over here we want the 10 nautical mile range. We press the traffic button to ensure that traffic is visible, as is shown down here. And we ensure that the VORs or ADFs are displayed as needed. Finally, we show the airports on our map. And that's it. So do not select weather or terrain over here. Especially do not select weather, as that would activate the weather radar, which would emit its radiation in the front of the plane and could be very harmful to anybody standing in front of the aircraft or in the terminal. Next up we move over to the MCP. Over here we activate the two flight director switches. We ensure that the auto throttle arm switches are in the up position and the bank angle selector is on the auto position and the autopilot disengage bar is up. Finally, the altitude selector is set on auto, but we do not set any numbers up here yet. That is going to be part of the final CDU pre-flight procedure, which we are going to carry out at a later point. Then we can move on to the right to the Display Select panel. Now on this panel you can select all the different synoptic pages like status or engine or anything else. Now there are no rules on how to set this panel up, but what is commonly done in the 777 is that the left page is selected to the door page so that you can monitor what's going on with the doors around your aircraft, and the right page would normally be set to the camera. Now, unfortunately, due to an MSFS limitation, the camera is currently not available. Nonetheless, I'm including this in the tutorial because maybe Asobo makes it available in the future, and therefore I want to have it covered. Now, there's a small trick that 777 pilots use on the Display Select panel occasionally. You can see right now I've just selected the right-hand nav display to the camera, and the right inboard display selector is active. If you want to quickly return this to the navigation display, you can use the inboard display selector and switch it to nav, and that is automatically going to show the nav display and reselect the lower center position on the Display Select panel. Move it back to the MFD position, and now you are basically back to where you were with the nav display shown. So just to show you that again, for example, now I'm showing the status page on the right side. If I just cycle the inboard display selector to nav and back to MFD, then we're back on the nav display and the selector returns to the lower center panel. Going on to the first officer's EFIS control panel, then we basically make the same selections that we have on the captain's panel or as needed. This returns us to our main panel, so we can start down here with the oxygen mask, which is in the 100% position. The chart and work table lights are out, the tiller is in the centered position, and then we ensure that our forward panel brightness is all set to auto and the panel floodlights are set as needed. The heaters can be set as needed, and the source select panel is by default all off. So for example, if you selected something over here, then you could switch the sources around to the alternate sources available, but if all the switches are off, then all the sources are set to their default panel. Moving on to the clock, if installed, this is an option in the Boeing 777. Some aircraft are equipped with digital watches. We ensure that the push selector is on UTC, the selector on the right side is set to run, and the elapsed timer is in the hold position. And if an elapsed time is shown down here, we could reset that at this point in time. Moving on then, across the panel we've got the inboard display selector, which is set to the multifunction display, and the heading reference knob is set to the norm position, unless a true heading reference is required for our departure. In that case we could select true up here, but as mentioned, normally this is kept in the norm position, unless your charts explicitly tell you a true heading is required for departure. The integrated standby flight displays are set as needed. Basically we ensure that the altimeter setting is shown and that we have deselected any previous approach indication that we might still have had, and the brightness is set as needed. Moving on to the right side, we've got the ground proximity panel, where we ensure that the flap override, gear override and terrain override switches are off and guarded, and the alternate gear extension is guarded. The landing gear lever is down, and we set the auto brake into the RTO position. On the right side, the FMC selector is set to auto, and the inboard display selector is set to the MFD position, and again on the right hand side the source select panel is as needed, and the display brightness is all in the 12 o'clock position with the panel floodlight set as needed. From here we can move further downwards, and we've got a panel here below the lower display unit that is often missed. So down here we've got the brightness selectors for the center display unit and the display control switch, which we ensure is off. From here on we can move down and we ensure that the park and brake is set. The speed brakes are in the down detent position and the alternate pitch trim switches are in the middle. Stabilizer trim cutout switches are guarded. Fuel control switches are in the cutoff position, and then we can move on to the right hand side where we ensure that the flap selector matches the actual flap position. Now the actual flap position is normally shown down here. If the flap selector is not shown on the ICAS, then the flaps are in the up position. Therefore, up is selected down here. Moving down to the alternate flap selectors, we checked those as part of the electrical power up already, but nonetheless we ensure that off is selected and that the arm switch is in the guarded position. This leads us down to the pedestal, where we can start setting up our radios. Now, the left-hand radio is normally used for the currently active ATC frequency. So, for example, we could select the delivery frequency in here. Now, since we're flying offline, this is not really going to matter too much, but what we have to do is we ensure that the left radio is selected on the left side. If anything non-normal was tuned, like center for example, you would see that light come on over here, so make sure that the correct radios are selected. Moving down to the audio control panel, we want to transmit on the left radio, and we also want to listen to it. Now, by default, you will listen to it whenever the microphone is selected there, but we can also turn on the speaker so that in case we select a different microphone, for example to the flight interphone, we are still able to listen to the left VHF radio. We want to listen to VHF left, VHF right, and the flight interphone, and it is also good practice to turn the speaker up so that you're able to listen to your radios without having to wear the headset. Going further down, on the weather radar, we select weather and turbulence and ensure that the gain switches are in the 12 o'clock position, which is the automatic gain functionality. Next up, we've got the center radio, and on here we need to ensure that data is active. So, data is needed for the aircraft's data link systems to work, unless we've got a satellite communication system fitted, but even if we have one, SATCOMs are rather prone to failure. For that reason, you want data to be available as the backup so that the plane has CPDLC capabilities and ACAS capabilities at any given time. Now, some pilots use the standby frequency on the center VHF as a reminder for the expected departure frequency. So, if we have a look at our departure chart, we can see that New York departure is on 135.9, and we can pre-select that down here. Not because we actually want to use it, so we don't want to use the center radio for radio transmissions unless the left and right radios are not working, but it serves as a mere reminder of what our departure frequency is going to be, which makes it much easier when we line up on the runway to select the departure frequency that we actually need. The audio control panel down here is used by the observers, so it's used by the third and in some occasions fourth pilot through the headsets that we have in the back over here. So since we're only flying with 2 pilots today, we don't need the third audio control panel tuned. What some airlines require is that public announcements are recorded, so in these cases the PA button might be set active over here so that PAs are getting recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. Moving further down, the observer audio is in the norm position and the flight deck door selector is deactivated on PMDG aircraft for security reasons. Moving on then, our engine fire switches are in the pushed in position, and our center CDU is by default selected to the cabin interphone. So normally you would use this whenever needed, for example to make cabin communication calls, to pre-select your satellite communication system and stuff like that. But whenever it is not needed, you would normally go back to the menu and then put it onto cabin interphone, because this enables you to make calls to your remaining crew quickly. Now, for simulation purposes, normally you could use menu and then, for example, FS actions if you wanted to carry out anything down here, but whenever you're finished, go back to menu and set it back to the cabin interphone. Going down to the trim panel, we ensure that the aileron and the rudder trim switches are in the neutral position, and we ensure that there are no warning lights showing on the printer. Finally, we've got the right-hand block, and over here we ensure that the emergency frequency 1 to 1.5 is set active in the radios, and the standby radio can be used for any company frequencies or maybe the local firefighting, anything that the company needs. If ACAS is not available, you would normally use this for your ATIS frequency as well. The audio control panel again is set the same way as the captain's, so we want to transmit on the left radio and we want to listen to it. We want to listen to the right radio and to the flight interphone, and we also turn up the speaker. This leads us down to the transponder, and there are two different transponders available in the PMDG 777. One of them includes TCAS controls, like above and below, which we'll talk about in a few moments. The other only has the ability to control the squawk and the active transponder mode. So if you've got the advanced transponder that we fitted to the airplane over here, make sure that above is selected on the TCAS modes on both sides, which ensures that traffic is shown until 7,800 feet above your current airplane altitude. So that makes it a little bit easier to predict what is coming in the future. The absolute or relative selector determines whether airplane altitude is shown in absolute altitude, so for example 350 for an airplane flying at flight level 350, or relative altitude, which would for example be plus 1000 for an aircraft 1000 feet above you. Normally this is left on the relative position. The source selector is kept on norm, and the transponder selector itself is set differently depending on airline philosophy. So some airlines, for example, want the transponder to be set to the left system when the captain is pilot flying, or to the right system when the first officer is pilot flying. Others use left on odd days and right on even days, and so on. So several different philosophies available there. Getting to the squawk, in the absence of an ATC clearance, we're going to select a squawk of 2000, and the transponder mode should be on standby down here on the ground. Moving down on the panel then, we've got the evacuation panel, where we ensure that the command button is guarded and the horn shut-off button is in the pushed-in position. Just to show you, this is what it looks like pulled, this is what it looks like pushed. So you might just have to push it to ensure that it's in the correct position. An evacuation test is not normally conducted, this is a maintenance-only function. The floor lights control the lighting on the aft part of the flight deck and are normally left in the middle or the off position unless needed for cockpit lighting control. Finally, we've got the AL stand panel floodlights located down here. The larger selector controls the background lighting and is normally left in the 12 o'clock position so that it's getting controlled from the master brightness panel, and the floodlights are set as needed. So down here you can see this shines a light on the complete pedestal. Alright, and this concludes our general flight deck setup. I hope that you learned something on this video. I hope I didn't make it too long for you. Let me know, give me feedback in the video description and in the comments below. Finally, if you are interested in a full-length version of this with even more background details, check out my 777 ebook. More on that in the video description below. Finally, I would like to thank you very much for watching. Hope that you learned something today. As always, like, comment and subscribe if you're up for more. And if you really love what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again on the next one.